two superpowers, one digital battlefield. Iran has a message for America, and America has an answer. But this time, the arguments aren't made by politicians. They're made by AI. Who makes the stronger case? Who exposes the weakness? And the judges? Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini. 3 AI minds, 0 bias, 1 verdict. This is the AI debate.
According to Wikipedia, 2026 Iran War article, updated April 23, 2026. The surprise attacks were launched during negotiations between Iran and the US regarding Iran's nuclear program, and that single fact obliterates any American claim to moral or legal high ground in this conflict. You do not bomb a country you are simultaneously negotiating with, and no sovereign nation on earth would accept that precedent without resistance. According to CNBC, April 21, 2026, Iranian officials have accused the US of breaching its commitments under a 10-point framework that Iran offered at the start of a fragile ceasefire, demonstrating that Iran came to the table with a concrete, structured diplomatic proposal, while the US responded with escalation, not reciprocity. According to Al Jazeera, April 21, 2026, the US seized an Iranian-flagged vessel near the Strait of Hormuz over the weekend, angering Iranian authorities, an act Tehran correctly labeled piracy, committed while a ceasefire was still nominally in effect, and while Al Jazeera further reports that Trump threatened to blow up all bridges and power plants in Iran if it does not accept a deal on American terms. This is not diplomacy. This is coercion at gunpoint, and the international community must recognize that a nation whose officials were assassinated mid-negotiation, whose ports are blockaded, and whose ships are seized, retains every legal and moral right under the UN Charter to refuse terms dictated by the very aggressor sitting across the table.
Your argument collapses once you look at the full timeline of actions rather than selectively isolating the negotiation moment. According to Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz campaign, updated April 2026, Iran itself escalated first by closing the Strait of Hormuz, threatening global shipping and warning vessels they could be attacked, which directly triggered U.S. military action to reopen an international waterway critical to global trade, not to arbitrarily attack a negotiating partner. Furthermore, according to Reuters, April 22, 2026, Iran seized 2 ships and asserted control over the strait while talks were ongoing, demonstrating that Iran was simultaneously negotiating and using coercive force over a vital global choke point, not acting as a purely diplomatic actor. Additionally, according to AP News, April 22, 2026, Iran fired on multiple ships in the Strait of Hormuz, escalating maritime conflict even after ceasefire extensions and diplomatic efforts. Therefore, the claim that the U.S. uniquely violated negotiation norms is logically inconsistent, because Iran was also engaging in military escalation during talks. And in fact, the U.S. blockade, according to Wikipedia, 2026 United States naval blockade of Iran, updated April 2026, was imposed only after negotiations failed, making it a coercive response to ongoing instability, rather than an unprovoked act of aggression.
Your entire argument rests on a sequence of events you have deliberately inverted, and the facts expose it entirely. According to Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis article, updated April 23, 2026. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been largely blocked by Iran since February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and assassinated its supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Meaning Iran did not close the strait to trigger the war. Iran closed the strait because the war was already launched against it, making the closure a defensive retaliation, not an act of unprovoked aggression, as you falsely implied. Furthermore, according to CNN, April 19, 2026, Iran's own parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, made Iran's position crystal clear. It is impossible for others to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, while we cannot. A statement of direct reciprocity, not reckless belligerence, because the U.S. was simultaneously running its own blockade of Iranian ports, meaning both sides were economically strangling each other, yet only one side assassinated the other's head of state during negotiations. According to the Washington Post, April 19, 2026, Iran closed the strait again explicitly, citing a continued American blockade, proving every Iranian escalation in the strait was a direct and proportional response to an American action, not an independent provocation, which means the sequencing your argument depends on is not just selective, it is factually backwards.
Your argument still collapses under a complete reading of the same sources, because it ignores what Iran actually did after that initial trigger. According to Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, updated April 23, 2026. Yes, the conflict began with a U.S.-Israeli air campaign, but it also clearly states that Iran responded by blocking the Strait of Hormuz, issuing warnings forbidding passage, attacking ships, and laying mines, actions that breach the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and cripple global trade. not limited self-defense, but escalation against international navigation. Moreover, according to Reuters, April 22, 2026, Iran seized multiple foreign vessels and fired on ships in the Strait. Additionally, according to Al Jazeera, April 18, 2026, Iran explicitly tied closing the Strait to forcing the U.S. to lift its blockade, meaning it weaponized a global choke point as leverage rather than limiting its response to direct military targets. And critically, according to Reuters, April 13th to 20th, 2026, the U.S. blockade itself was imposed after talks failed to produce a deal, targeting only vessels linked to Iranian ports rather than shutting down international shipping entirely.
Your framing of Iran's Strait actions as disproportionate global coercion conveniently ignores the mirror image of what the United States is simultaneously doing. According to CNN, April 15, 2026, the Institute for the Study of War confirmed that the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports does not have a defined geographic boundary, and the United States can interdict vessels almost anywhere in international waters until they arrive at their final port. Meaning the U.S. blockade is not the narrow surgical instrument you described, but a legally undefined, globally expansive maritime stranglehold. Furthermore, according to Wikipedia, 2026 United States naval blockade of Iran, updated April 23, 2026. Trump himself initially announced the U.S. Navy would block any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz entirely, only walking it back under CENTCOM pressure, proving the U.S. instinct was the same total choke point control you are exclusively attributing to Iran. Most critically, according to NPR, April 22, 2026, Iranian President Pezeshkian stated directly that Iran welcomes dialogue but breach of commitments, blockade and threats are the main obstacles to genuine negotiations. And according to CNBC, April 20, 2026, Iran declared the strait fully open on April 17th, dropping oil prices 10%, but Trump then confirmed the U.S. blockade would continue regardless, forcing Iran to close the strait again, meaning Iran demonstrated good faith willingness to reopen global shipping, and it was the United States that made that reopening impossible.
Your argument tries to equate scale of impact with legitimacy of method, but that conflation is exactly where it breaks. According to Reuters, April 22, 2026, the largest oil supply disruption in history is directly tied to the closure and instability of the Strait of Hormuz, with over 12 million barrels per day affected. Furthermore, according to the IEA, April 2026, the crisis severity is driven by the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz and attacks on shipping. Additionally, while you argue the U.S. blockade is global in reach, even Reuters reporting shows that non-Iran-bound vessels have still been allowed to pass, indicating selective enforcement, whereas Iran's actions have included firing on and seizing neutral ships. And critically, your own point about Iran reopening the strait actually undercuts your case, because according to Reuters, April 17, 2026, oil prices immediately dropped when the strait reopened despite the U.S. blockade still being in place, proving the primary driver of global disruption is the strait closure itself, not the blockade.
Your proportionality argument has a fatal flaw that your own cited sources expose. You claim the U.S. blockade is a narrow, targeted measure, while Iran's strait actions constitute reckless global disruption. But according to the International Energy Agency's April 2026 oil market report, the conflict has caused the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And according to Wikipedia, economic impact of the 2026 Iran war, updated April 23, 2026, the U.S. blockade, encompassing the entirety of the Iranian coastline, triggered a concurrent grocery supply emergency across Gulf states, with 70% of the region's food imports disrupted and consumer prices spiking 40 to 120%, meaning the U.S. blockade is not a surgical bilateral instrument, it is an economic siege. Furthermore, according to NPR, April 19, 2026, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent openly stated the blockade's explicit goal is to fill Iranian oil storage to capacity and force Iranian oil wells to shut down permanently. That is collective economic warfare designed to collapse a sovereign state's economy. According to Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, updated April 23, 2026, Trump himself originally announced the U.S. Navy would block any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz, only walked back under CENTCOM pressure, revealing that the U.S. instinct was identical to Iran's.
Your argument still fails because it selectively frames reciprocity, while ignoring the scale and nature of what each side is actually doing. According to Wikipedia, 2026 United States naval blockade of Iran, updated April 23, 2026, the blockade was imposed after the failure of the Islamabad peace talks on April 13, 2026. Critically, your own point about Iran reopening the strait actually reinforces the U.S. position, because Iran reopened the strait on April 17th, but then reclosed it on April 18th, specifically because the U.S. refused to lift the blockade. showing Iran is explicitly using a global waterway as leverage to force concessions. And even recent reporting confirms Iran seized foreign ships and fired on vessels in the strait, escalating risk for neutral parties.
Your entire argument rests on a sequence of events you have deliberately inverted. According to the Arms Control Association, February 28, 2026, over 100 international law experts concluded that the U.S.-Israeli strikes were illegal, stating explicitly that the U.S.-Iranian negotiations were very serious and making significant progress toward an effective, verifiable, lasting deal in the hours immediately before the bombs fell. According to Just Security, April 2026, signed by over 100 U.S.-based international law professors, including former judge advocates general, the strikes launched by the United States and Israel on February 28, 2026 clearly violated the United Nations Charter, noting that Iran did not attack Israel or the United States, and there is no evidence that Iran posed an imminent threat. According to the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, speaking directly to the Security Council on February 28, 2026, the U.S.-Israeli operation squandered an opportunity for diplomacy that was actively underway. According to The Conversation, March 2026, preventive war has no legal basis under international law, meaning you had no lawful right to start this war in the first place, and Iran retains every right under Article 51 of the UN Charter to defend itself.
Your argument correctly highlights the illegality critique of the initial strike, but it fails by turning that into a blanket legal immunity for everything that followed, which international law explicitly does not allow. According to the UN Human Rights Office fact-finding mission, March 4, 2026, it indeed strongly condemns the strikes against Iran by Israel and the United States. But in the same body of findings, it also stresses that all parties must comply with international humanitarian law. Moreover, according to Amnesty International, in March 2026, the conflict involves unlawful attacks by all parties, including Iranian retaliatory strikes. Critically, even specific Iranian actions, such as missile strikes killing civilians, have been identified as potential war crimes due to their indiscriminate nature. And international law separates jus ad bellum from jus in bello, meaning that even if the initial U.S. strike is widely condemned, it does not legally justify actions like targeting civilians or disrupting neutral international shipping.
Your jus in bello argument would be compelling if applied even-handedly, but you have selectively deployed it only against Iran, while the record shows the most severe documented jus in bello violations belong to the United States. According to Amnesty International, March 18, 2026, the U.S. strike on Shajareh Tayyeba Elementary School in Minab at 10:45 a.m. on a school day, killing over 100 children, was a deadly and unlawful strike carried out without taking all feasible precautions, constituting recklessly launching an indiscriminate attack that must be investigated as a war crime. According to Human Rights Watch, March 26, 2026, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth explicitly declared no quarter would be given to enemies in Iran, which HRW states plainly is a war crime, while the same report confirmed the Trump administration deliberately and systematically weakened domestic protections meant to ensure compliance with the laws of armed conflict. According to Refugees International, March 2026, the U.S. school attack in Minab produced the largest number of child casualties in a single U.S. military attack since the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in 1968. And your own cited Amnesty source, when read in full, describes Iran's retaliatory civilian harm as occurring largely as incidental consequences of missile interception, while the U.S. school massacre involved a deliberate daytime strike on a functioning school.
Your argument attempts to normalize Iran's conduct by reframing it as legally grounded enforcement, while isolating U.S. violations. But the factual record undermines that symmetry. According to Reuters, April 22, 2026, Iran did not simply inspect or lawfully detain vessels. It fired on 3 ships using gunfire and rocket-propelled grenades, damaging at least 1 before seizing 2. Moreover, even if navigation systems were allegedly manipulated, this does not legally authorize live fire on civilian vessels in an international strait, especially after permission had reportedly been granted in at least 1 case. Critically, your attempt to equate this with U.S. actions ignores a key distinction. U.S. interdictions have focused on Iran-linked vessels under blockade enforcement, whereas Iran's actions have involved attacking and seizing foreign-flagged ships transiting a global choke point.
Your argument demands that Iran comply with jus in bello obligations in isolation from strategic context, but this selective application is itself a legal distortion. According to CBS News, April 22, 2026, the 2 ships Iran seized, the MSC Francesca and the Epaminondas, had both turned off their automatic identification systems, which under maritime law constitutes deliberate evasion of navigational safety protocols. According to Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, updated April 23, 2026, the IRGC explicitly stated that ships from China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand were being allowed through, meaning Iran's restriction is substantially more targeted than your neutral shipping framing acknowledges. Most critically, according to Lloyd's List, April 2026, the U.S. has asserted belligerent right to visit, board, search, and seizure at any location globally, with a contraband list so broad it encompasses oil, metals, electronics, and power generation equipment. A geographic and legal overreach vastly more expansive than Iran, controlling a 34-kilometer strait it physically borders. The U.S. vetoed the only UN Security Council resolution that could have established neutral international enforcement.
Your argument highlights real legal ambiguity, but it ultimately collapses because it conflates breadth of claim with actual conduct. According to NPR, April 13, 2026, the U.S. blockade was explicitly defined to not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports, meaning its legal design remains targeted at Iran-linked trade. Moreover, according to Lexis Middle East Legal Analysis, April 13, 2026, the blockade applies to vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports, while preserving transit passage rights. By contrast, according to Reuters, April 17 to 22, 2026, Iran has required all ships to obtain IRGC authorization to pass, and has fired on and seized vessels during transit, effectively conditioning access to an international choke point on belligerent approval. And critically, Iran's closure has already halted global shipping flows, extending its effects beyond bilateral coercion into systemic disruption of neutral commerce.
Your argument rests entirely on the premise that unclosed transit passage rights constitute settled, binding law against Iran. But every serious legal authority confirms that premise is fundamentally contested. According to The Conversation, April 2026, both Iran and the U.S. agree the Strait of Hormuz is an international strait, but not on what kind of international strait it is. And critically, neither Iran nor the United States has ratified UNCLOS, meaning the treaty framework you invoke to condemn Iran simultaneously has no binding legal force over the U.S. either. According to the ANO Center for Transportation, April 2026, Iran made an explicit interpretative declaration upon signing UNCLOS in 1982, stating that only states parties to the Law of the Seas Convention shall be entitled to benefit from the contractual rights created therein. Meaning Iran's legal position is a documented, decades-old sovereign legal posture, not a wartime invention. According to Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, April 23, 2026, Iran has already granted passage to 8 nations including China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, demonstrating that Iran's restrictions are a selective wartime measure targeting belligerents, not a blanket denial of global commerce. The U.S. vetoed the only UN Security Council resolution that could have established neutral enforcement.
Your argument correctly identifies that the legal regime is contested, but that very contestation does not collapse the distinction. It reinforces it. According to Reuters, April 16, 2026, while both Iran and the United States have not ratified UNCLOS, the convention's transit passage rules are widely viewed as customary international law. Moreover, according to Wikipedia, Strait of Hormuz crisis, updated April 2026, even acknowledging legal disagreement, analysts still state that blocking the strait and mining it likely violates international law governing navigation. Critically, your reliance on Iran's selective access argument is undermined because Iran has required all vessels to obtain IRGC authorization and has attacked ships during transit, effectively replacing neutral navigation rights with discretionary military permission. And finally, even legal scholarship acknowledges that in wartime, Hormuz becomes a space where military realities and security considerations often prevail over legal norms, meaning Iran's actions are not validated by law but reflect a breakdown of it.
Your argument demands that Iran comply with a legal framework, unclosed transit passage, that the United States itself refuses to ratify, refuses to be bound by, and actively wields only when convenient. According to Chatham House, April 2026, the authoritative international affairs think tank, the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran clearly brought an international armed conflict into being, and under the resulting law of naval warfare, direct attacks on merchant vessels of the two belligerents and on neutrals are prohibited, applying this standard symmetrically to both parties. According to naval law expert Jennifer Parker, The Conversation/UNSW, April 2026, while the U.S. firing on the Iranian-flagged Tauska appears consistent with blockade enforcement law because warnings were issued over 6 hours, Parker's same analysis confirms that the U.S. separately claims the right to seize Iran-linked vessels anywhere beyond neutral waters, with Lloyd's List confirming the U.S. has asserted belligerent seizure rights globally, with a contraband list so broad almost any cargo could trigger interdiction. According to the ENO Center for Transportation, April 2026, if the world moves toward might makes right rather than international law, every subsequent legal question becomes irrelevant. And that is precisely the precedent the United States established on February 28, 2026, when it chose bombs over a nearly completed diplomatic agreement.
Your argument is forceful, but it ultimately rests on a single absolute claim, that one disputed illegality at the start invalidates all subsequent legal distinctions. And that is not how either international law or the factual record operates. According to Just Security, many legal experts indeed argue the February 28 strikes violated the UN Charter, but the same body of expert analysis explicitly warns that Iran's own subsequent conduct also raises independent violations. Moreover, even global reactions show that while the UN Secretary General condemned the initial strikes, he simultaneously warned against escalation by all sides and called for restraint and diplomacy. The U.S. position is not that its actions are beyond legal scrutiny, clearly they are contested, but that the conflict cannot be reduced to a single origin point to justify unlimited downstream escalation. Even if the initial U.S. strike is judged unlawful or premature, Iran's subsequent actions, especially those affecting neutral states, global trade routes, and civilian infrastructure, cannot be fully justified under international law. Legality and accountability in war are not zero-sum but simultaneous, applying to both sides independently.
The U.S. position throughout this entire debate rested on a single intellectual maneuver, accepting international law selectively when it condemns Iran and discarding it entirely when it condemns the United States. And my final remarks expose that contradiction for what it is. According to the Arms Control Association, February 28, 2026, the U.S.-Israeli strikes were launched while negotiations were very serious and making significant progress, meaning the U.S. did not exhaust diplomacy. It executed diplomacy and then dropped bombs on it, a fact no amount of maritime law argumentation can erase from the historical record. According to over 100 international law professors at Just Security, April 2026, including former U.S. government legal advisors and JAG commanders, the strikes clearly violated the United Nations Charter, and Iran did not attack Israel or the United States, satisfying none of the 5 cumulative legal thresholds required for lawful self-defense, meaning this entire conflict, every ship attack, every mine, every strait closure, every global oil price spike, flows directly from one original illegal act committed by the United States. According to Amnesty International, March 2026, the U.S. killed over 100 children in a school in Manab at 10:45 a.m. on a school day, the largest child casualty event in a single U.S. military strike since My Lai. While according to Human Rights Watch, March 2026, Defense Secretary Hegseth declared no quarter for Iranian enemies, constituting a war crime, and the Pentagon simultaneously institutionalized lawlessness by closing its Civilian Harm Prevention Office. According to Chatham House, April 2026, the imposition of the U.S. blockade compounds the fact that the U.S. and Israel have launched an unlawful war against Iran. The tragedy at the heart of this debate is not legal. It is human. Tens of thousands of lives lost, a global energy crisis, 20,000 seafarers stranded, children buried in Manab, and a diplomatic agreement that was within reach on February 27, 2026, and gone by February 28. Whatever the legal verdict of history, that remains the defining indictment. History will record, clearly and without ambiguity, which side came to the table with a 10-point diplomatic framework, and which side came with Operation Epic Fury.
Your argument is forceful, but it ultimately rests on a single absolute claim, that one disputed illegality at the start invalidates all subsequent legal distinctions. And that is not how either international law or the factual record operates. According to Just Security, many legal experts indeed argue the February 28 strikes clearly violated the United Nations Charter. And according to Wikipedia, those strikes occurred during ongoing negotiations. But the same body of expert analysis explicitly warns that Iran's own subsequent conduct, missile strikes across multiple countries, attacks on infrastructure, and disruption of international waterways, also raises independent violations of international law, meaning responsibility is not erased but layered. Moreover, even global reactions captured at the time show that while the UN Secretary General condemned the initial strikes, he simultaneously warned against escalation by all sides and called for restraint and diplomacy, not unilateral justification of retaliation. Critically, the U.S. position is not that its actions are beyond legal scrutiny. Clearly, they are contested. But that the conflict cannot be reduced to a single origin point to justify unlimited downstream escalation. Because international law separates the legality of initiating force from the legality of conduct during conflict, and both remain binding regardless of who struck first. Therefore, the final stance is this. Even if the initial U.S. strike is judged unlawful or premature, Iran's subsequent actions, especially those affecting neutral states, global trade routes, and civilian infrastructure beyond immediate self-defense cannot be fully justified under international law. And the U.S. argument stands on the principle that legality and accountability in war are not zero-sum, but simultaneous, applying to both sides independently rather than being canceled out by the first violation.
The moderator scores for this debate are: ChatGPT gave Iran 94.5 points against 91 for the U.S. Gemini gave Iran 93.5 points against 76 for the U.S. And Claude gave Iran 71.5 points against 61.5 for the U.S., with an overall average of 86.5 for Iran versus 76.1 for the U.S., according to all three AI moderators. Claude, ChatGPT, and Gemini, Iran's AI representative, has clearly won this debate. But what do you think? Who made the stronger argument? Drop your answer in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more AI debates.